time, right place. Like anything can be a medicine and anything can be a toxin, given the right time and the right place. I think that myth of if I am not succeeding, then I just need to work hard. And I think that's creating a lot of internal turmoil, sense of failure, shame, and a whole lot of burnout. Yeah, so first training as an occupational therapist, and I went through the mental health system. So I used to work in acute mental health and community. The difficult thing was going from a very accepted field to a very challenged field that comes with a lot of scepticism.
But how did you process that? Because how does that feel, being so well respected, OT, mental health practitioner in the hospital system, the gold standard of practice, to then being even potentially called charlatan? Nat, thanks for joining me here today. Really appreciate you making the time in your super busy schedule. Now, you're a kinesiologist.
Yep.
And I was trying to explain what kinesiology is to a friend previously, and I was having a lot of trouble. So I'm hoping that you can explain today what kinesiology is, and we're going to go into all of that. But I've had a bit of background in it. I saw a kinesiologist back in my playing days as a tennis player, and more used it around musculoskeletal impairments and motor functioning stuff there. But then I actually have a degree in kinesiology in the States, but that's very different. So kinesiology in the States was just a simple terminology for kines meaning movement and the study of movement. So it's akin to exercise physiology here. So I just say ex-phys to people here, but it was kind of funny that like the degree actually says on the certificate kinesiology, but absolutely completely different, nothing to do with what you do in applied kinesiology, I believe.
Yeah, it's called applied kinesiology often in the US.
It's called applied in the US?
Yeah, out here we just call it kinesiology. In the rest of the world we just call it kinesiology. In the US, because it's got that original more medical model term of like muscle movement, kinetic energy kind of movement. They have the kinesiology, which is like our ex-phys physiology. Kind of
understanding how the human body moves. But I would think that with the word kines meaning movement, there'd be some sort of language origin similarity there. But for all the listeners, because a lot of people are like, what? It starts with a K, kinesiology. So if you could please explain to us what on earth kinesiology is, and maybe even where it originated and the bit of story of that.
Yeah, and completely understandable that it's a complex thing. There's even disagreements within the field around it because of the different origins and kind of all the different places that have contributed to kinesiology. So I'll go the definition, the kind of most widely accepted definition first, and that is that it's a health modality that uses the tool of gentle manual muscle testing or muscle monitoring to identify the underlying stresses in your body or a system.
Okay.
So the difference, I'd say, from the kinesiology you're talking about to the kinesiology of the more holistic modality that I'll go into is the muscle monitoring or muscle testing component of it. So it's kinesiology as the profession that I'm talking about sits in the complementary medicine, alternative medicine sphere because of the underlying principles that it's based on, which I think I'll kind of go into. But it's both the modality and a tool, which is where some of the confusion comes into. So the modality as a whole is kinesiology, but there's also the tool of muscle testing, which can be used in amongst other modalities. And so some people say they use kinesiology, but they're not a kinesiologist.
Right. So if we separate the two, so using kinesiology is the tool and the kinesiologist is the modality?
Yeah, that's a good way of looking at it. But the kinesiologist uses that tool in a much more rounded way, pulling on a lot of the holistic therapies, modalities within it. But the key stream across all kinesiology apart from the US. Clinical definition of kinesiology is the muscle testing part of it. So probably should help explain that first. Otherwise, it makes no sense.
Because then people are going, okay, you do muscle testing. So am I on a treadmill? Am I seeing my strength? Am I in the gym?
Yeah.
Like, what do we mean by muscle testing?
Yeah, well, I mean, technically, I think we're supposed to call it muscle monitoring because, say, a physio and ex-phys would do muscle testing where they might look at the strength and the integrity of a muscle. But where we as kinesiologists use it, we use the biofeedback aspect of the muscle in the muscle monitoring. So if any of your listeners have done any significant weight training or even just kind of lived really, you'll have experienced this concept of a muscle switching off. Yeah, where you might be walking along the street and suddenly your quad just kind of like gives out and it just switches off momentarily. Or when you're training, you're kind of training to fail. And it wasn't until I studied kinesiology I understood the whole weightlifting thing. I used to watch the Olympics and the weightlifting was always fascinating. And I used to wonder why someone would train and get all the way to the Olympics and then kind of lift the bar up and then give up halfway. Because that's what it looked like.
It looked like they were giving up, but it was just total muscular failure.
But it's total muscular failure.
Yeah.
And what that is, it's not a gradual failure. What is happening in that, there's a mechanism within our neurological muscle system where if the muscle is about to tear, it'll send a biofeedback signal of that amount of pressure and tear. It'll send a biofeedback signal to somewhere in the brain, which will then say switch off. And it'll send an instantaneous muscle and the muscle will go and switch off.
Right.
And that's where we feel that kind of just collapse, that give. That's the biofeedback mechanism that we use in kinesiology, muscle testing.
Right. And because I always think the evolutionary reason for that, is it just simply a protective mechanism of that you're about to rip the muscle belly off the bone and you need to stop?
Yep. Yeah. So there's that. But with that, it's like the feedback loop, I like to think of it, other kinesiologists might not agree with me, we're kind of using that feedback loop to hack in to the body systems. And that's how the kinesiology as a modality works. So the feedback loop of that, there's all these signals in my muscle and it's trying to monitor all the time where I'm at because the muscle system's a big biofeedback loop in the body. Yeah, I'm sitting here at the moment. I've got feedback coming from all the muscles that are connected to the various different surfaces, my arms, my head. If we didn't have constant biofeedback going, we'd fall over anytime we turned around. So it's a really big part of our biofeedback. So when we tap into it, we're able to, with the kinesiology, we're able to access a whole lot of information about what's going on in the body in any given time and place.
Right. And is it bidirectional in the sense that the proprioception and what's happening externally is giving feedback to the neurological system, but why would the neurological system be putting out information the other way?
From a survival perspective,
kind
of stuff. Yeah. Well, so one of the kind of lay sayings we have in kinesiology is our psychology affects our physiology. I don't think that's a particularly hard thing to get your head around. There's also the concept of physiology affects your psychology.
Yeah, it's bidirectional.
Yeah,
for
so
sure.
we know, you get nervous before an event. Some people get butterflies. Some people's bladder tells them they need to go to the toilet. That's the bidirectional biofeedback loop happening right there. So part of I believe the feedback loop coming back is to give us a sense of where we're at. An interoceptive feedback loop to go, hey, I'm stressed. This is too much pressure. This is putting a load on your system. This is increasing your heart rate. This is altering your hormones. This is not feeling good in the system, or this is feeling good in the system. And so it's that bidirectional feedback loop that we're really trying to tap into with kinesiology to get an understanding of what are the underlying stresses within your system.
Okay.
That's that underlying stress part.
Yeah, and so you're able to then have an understanding of what the body is sensing in that moment about a certain thing, and you can see that via the muscle testing?
Yeah.
Right.
So that's how it works. So in to kind of paint a picture, we might someone might come to me regarding a repeated injury. Yeah. And physio, everything, it's repaired, but they're like not sure what's going on. And it might be fine in the moment, but when you put it into a particular context, they're starting to get the same symptoms back. And you might be able to look with the kinesiology testing, okay, it's not a muscle feedback problem that's going on there. The neurology is working completely fine, which is why physiology testing, your exercise phys, your physiotherapist is kind of saying it's cool, but when we put you under psychological stress, you've got a muscle memory of that, and that's kind of showing up from that perspective. So we can use the feedback loop to start to get in to see in what particular area might there be stress.
Yeah, and that's super interesting, because how can you then access it, or how can you set up that context if the body of the person is not in that context to get that feedback?
It's a really good question.
Because I've always wondered that, because like the little bit I've known, it's like, well, you know, you've got a patient there and you're doing the testing and they're in just, you know, your treatment room doing that. And so they're not in the context, but you can, I don't know, is that an understanding that you can ask the body about the context? And I just wonder how that works, how the neurology then provides that, that like switches the muscle off to give the information back.
Yeah. So I might need to explain a bit more about some of the underlying assumptions under kinesiology to answer that. So I might divert off if I can first. So I think if you get some of the underlying principles that kinesiology is based on, it gets a little bit easier to start to understand it. So the first assumption I think most kinesiologists make is that we have in our body an underlying energy of life force, chi, prana, life energy, that again a lot of the complementary medicine fields are based on. Yeah, so that we have this life force that is there to assist us, like to feed us energy in life that lets us know when we're thriving versus lets us know when we're not. And it goes up and down based on how we're using it and how we're feeding it to a degree, to put it really basically. The other assumption that kinesiology is based on is that the body has the ability to heal itself. Now that is where some people can get a little bit uncomfortable with the idea of kinesiology, but I think there's a really easy way of summing that up, and that is that the body desires homeostasis.
Yes.
We function in homeostasis. That's the biochemical.
At a cellular level. It's
at a
trying
cellular
to reach
level.
Homeostasis.
Yeah, we're trying to reach homeostasis. We, just to speak a bit more to the audience, that concept of, it's like our body temperature is a great example. We like to sit at a particular body temperature because if we go too below that, the cells don't function well. If we get too above that, the cells don't function well. So and that's part of that biofeedback in our system. So if we're starting to get a little bit cold, the body's sensing that, it starts to send biofeedback to all the different parts that's needed, and we might start to shiver to create heat to keep our cells in that homeostatic balance point, and vice versa, hot, sweat. And so we're constantly moving in and out of homeostasis and doing this dance. And stresses are designed to pull us out of balance, and then when a body system is working properly, we will naturally bring ourselves back towards homeostasis. And that, I think, is the underlying principle of healing ourselves. The healing happens in that bringing ourselves back into homeostasis. And, and we use some of that life force and that prana to bring ourselves back into homeostasis until we don't.
Okay. I'm interested. How do we don't?
And the don't, I think we can all recall the times we don't. Like you could, when you were playing tennis, you would have had, no doubt, probably ways or kinesiologist, like you could have injuries and repair, and like in injury and repair, and you recover, and then there'll be a certain injury you just don't recover from.
Yeah.
Right? It just doesn't. And that's when kinesiology really comes kind of to the forefront, because, we're most of us are pretty smart beings, and a lot of your audience would be pretty self-aware a lot of the time. if you knew what the problem was, you would have sorted it out.
Yeah.
So what we're trying to do with kinesiology is to find the bits that we don't know what's going on.
Okay. Yeah, I quite like that. So, because I was talking to a client a little bit ago about, like, because they were talking about seeing a psychologist, and they're like, you don't know what's inside the bottle. It's hard to read the label from inside the bottle, I think they were saying. I was like, oh, I love that.
That's a great one.
And for me, it's like, yeah, for seeing a psychologist, it's like I am able to then maybe understand what's on the label and then give that back to the client, so then they know what to do, and they're the expert on what's happening in their bottle. But sometimes they need to be able to read a label so they can do what they need to do and thrive and whatnot. And I wonder if that principle maybe applies in this. And I'm looking at it from a psychological point of view, and I know you've done some training in mental health as well. But is that maybe from a neurological point of view that you're able to give people a bit of understanding what's on the label?
Yeah, I like that.
It's yours. It's not copyright. Yeah.
Thank you, Clyde.
Yeah.
That's a really nice way of looking at it. And yeah, there's not a lot of research done on kinesiology, unfortunately, because it's not in a field that people are going to pay for the research, unfortunately. But there was some research done fairly recently, and I cannot recall the lovely person who did the research at where it was done. I think it was over in the UK, and it was anecdotal feedback on why people went to kinesiologists and what they got out of it. And the key one was really about a better understanding of what was actually happening in their body, and they got a better buy-in too much like around the issues and the change perspective than they might in some other forms of modality because of the biofeedback component.
So they were saying that they had an increased awareness of self and awareness of ailments and problems?
Yes, as well as a quicker kind of uptake around some of the change base because of that biofeedback.
Right.
So I might tell you, can I tell you a story on this
I'd love the story.
So this was, and I know you're going to ask me about my journey into kinesiology, but this was early in my experience of kinesiology myself. I had a lot of allergies, and I went to my kinesiologist because one of my allergies that I was have a problem with is chocolate.
Really?
Yeah, no,
I mean, some people might say that's fortunate. Some people might say it's unfortunate.
Well, exactly. So this is the thing, right? So I went to my kinesiologist, and it was a bit of chocolate. And was like, I'd love you to de-stress me, because that's another part we haven't even talked about with kinesiology yet. I'd love you to de-stress me around chocolate so that I can eat chocolate. And you can use it kind of directly. He put the stressor, the chocolate, on my body, and he said no. I was like, what? And he's like, no.
Can't do it.
Can't do it. The feedback was that your body's not giving me permission, which is a really weird concept, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's a really weird concept, but that's one of the things I love about kinesiology. There's this concept of this biofeedback from my body, and my body went, it kind of, in a roundabout way, said no. And so I was like, what do you mean no? Like,
yeah, on many levels.
You're here to help me.
Yeah.
This makes me sick.
Yeah.
And he was really brilliant. He just asked me, he said, well, what would you do if you were able to eat chocolate and it didn't give you the problems it gives you? And in that moment, I was like, oh. And because what my head did, and my answer was, well, I would do exactly what the rest of my family does, which is abuse chocolate, use it to suppress my emotions and overindulge. And in that moment, I realised I didn't even see that family history. I had multiple family members who ate a block of chocolate for breakfast. That was, I know, right? Like for breakfast.
Wow.
And so in that moment, I was like, I didn't get angry. I went, how cool is my body?
Yeah.
How cool is my body that it helped, like in that little moment of just like, no. I was like, oh, of course. I can't be trusted with chocolate. And these are all the reasons why. And it was great. And I was like, perfect. And I've a totally different relationship with chocolate ever since that moment.
Right. It's a fascinating story, and my scientific brain just fires off and goes, causation, correlate, and it's so the first question there is going like, I think most people would go, well, how did he know? Like, what mechanism is he using? And if we, think of from that, the standardized measures type thing, is like, how would he know what the body is saying in terms of to be able to replicate that skill set?
Beautiful. So I'll be the first to point out and not apologise for the fact that there isn't a lot of standardised measures in kinesiology. And there's going to be several reasons for that. I know there'll be a lot within the field who would love to be a little bit more validated. But so the kinesiology is, and probably of all the modalities I've come across, one of the most client-centred modality, although we all like to be client-centred in our work. Kinesiology, from a principle, is incredibly client-centred. It's not modality-centred.
Right.
And so that brings up a lot of inherent questions and difficulties in working with the modality. So it's like, so if we were to go completely scientific, if this muscle feedback mechanism works, which is I put a stress on the body and your muscle might fail. Yeah, like we get that biofeedback mechanism where the muscle switches off, which is a sign of failing, or showing that so my muscle might be working correctly, and I could add a stress into the system, and then my muscle fails. It gives that collapse mechanism I mentioned in the weightlifting kind of thing. It gives this which we could call it a fail, but it's a switch off. So it's not a weakening. It's not I'm putting more pressure on, the therapist is overriding me. It's just the muscle's working and now suddenly the muscle isn't working. That's how a kinesiologist kind of navigates through the stresses with someone. And it's not a straight yes, no, is this good for you, yes, no, because it's not like we're dynamic systems, creatures. Yeah, there's no black or white. So it's an in the moment response, which will come back to your question, but it is an in the moment response, and so I know they did some. I think someone attempted many years ago to replicate kinesiology using a robotic arm.
Okay.
So to take the practitioner component out of it, and it got really mixed results, and that doesn't surprise me because of the dynamic nature of kinesiology and the interrelated kind of energy that happens in any form of therapy modality, really. So it's not a foolproof science. And me personally, I don't have a problem with that. Even though I was science medically trained, I don't have a problem with that because of that, again, that underlying kind of principle of the body knowing how to heal itself from that kind of biochemical cellular process. I also believe there's a deeper body wisdom with that. And the journey of kinesiology wakes that kind of body wisdom up. And I shared that story around chocolate because I think that was the beginning for me of going, body, like I might want it, like head down, top down approach. Of course I want to be able to eat chocolate, and of course I can say I can be trusted, but every other cell in my body went, and that was shown through that muscle switching off. That's how he kind of did it. It's like you put it on the body, there's this stress with it, and then we use that same muscle testing to kind of go, well, how do we repair or rebalance that stress in the system? And he was just getting a kind of a body failure response which is kind of the only way to do it, is potentially remove that stressor from the system.
Right. So no more chocolate.
So I now eat tiny little bits of chocolate because
Yeah.
I'm learning to be trusted. Trust myself with it. So yeah, I can have a piece of chocolate and I'm okay.
Okay. So
Yeah.
the idea is that when the stressor, the chocolate, was placed on you, your body gave a biofeedback.
Yep.
And the practitioner had your arm, something like that.
Yep.
And then they try and test its strength. And if there's a failure, then that gives an understanding of what the body, how the body's interacting with that.
Yeah, it just gives it just gives an indication of stressor, an interrupter. So probably the best way to look at it is there's a biofeedback loop happening between the muscle and a particular part of the brain, which is like there's pressure, there's no pressure, there's pressure, and the muscles can hold in that circumstance. And then when we add another piece of information into the system, again, we're complex beings. We should be able to have pressure on a muscle, do a maths problem, think about dinner, all of that kind of stuff. And our system shouldn't switch itself off. Like if that's what's going on, we're in a pretty precarious health state, really. But if we should be able to handle all of this kind of stress, because that's the dynamic nature of our system. So if we add something into the system, like in that case, chocolate for me, that is a significant stressor, there's parts of my system that fail.
Right.
Even though I haven't consumed that piece of chocolate, there's, again, that prana, that life force aspect, even though it's not in my gut in that moment, there's a part of my system that recognises that thing, there's no judgment around it, it just knows that thing is a stressor for me. So, we could think of other things like putting something really toxic in someone's system, and we would expect that everyone's system would then fail. So,
Well, yes, and we have a biofield
Yeah.
around us, and that's very well established through the scientific literature that we are electromagnetic sort of being, and so we have this biofield around us, and it is one of the senses that we have in order to understand ourselves in the world. So I wonder if that also influences it to some degree, that whatever you want to name that field or call it whatever, but at a cellular level, our body is very much interacting with the environment constantly.
Absolutely, which is why we can put those stresses near the system and we can get a sense of it. It's also how we can, so finally answering that question you asked around the situational stress, like, I might be seeing you as a patient in that moment, but you're now testing something when I'm on the tennis court or in my office. How can you do that? Yeah, and that's because that same little electromagnetic energy, the moment you have a thought, that's registered in your field. So, and you would be better at explaining this with the psychology than I would, but there's parts of the brain I understand that don't see any difference between real and imagined.
Correct.
Like you see it, it's real, and there's no such thing as time really in our
time's
brain.
a construct.
Time's a construct. So there's no thing as time in our brain. And then we can start to get really funky with kinesiology, and then kind of go like actually pick up things that were like that happened 9 years ago that are still in your field because they're still responding almost degrees if they're now.
Well, and that's like, there's funky versions of that, and there's just very easy, understandable, literal understandings of that is going, well, there's muscle memory.
Yeah.
So the muscle literally stores memories, like we know from heart transplants.
Yeah.
That
research is cool.
That's wild.
Yeah.
That people that have a heart transplant from their donor have memories that they've never experienced from the donor. So that's wild. But then obviously we've got our own memory systems, and the way that memory stored is across the brain. It's not just the hippocampus. And depending on the sensory information that comes in, it's stored across different areas. So there are not just these episodic or semantic memories that we have from facts and information and narratives that happen to us. There's all this body information too. It makes sense that the body's going to store that. So something that happened 9 years ago, it's like, well, you've got a memory of that. What is memory? It's just a a neurological ability to store information.
And a bunch of chemicals.
Exactly. And then on more the sort of spookier side of it, I don't know what to call it, is because that whole, not to nerd out down this.
No, go for it.
This rabbit hole, because when I was doing a lot of physics stuff, there's that whole quantum mechanics type stuff where Einstein was doing that, what's called spooky relativity or something like that, that they were looking at atoms across different parts of the United States and they were interacting together. So that whole stuff, and there's, plenty of Marvel movies that try and tap into that and explain it. But it's all, very validated science. So I think the notion that the brain has memory, or the body, I should say, has memory of stuff that happened a while ago, and then also in a different context than that memory can come up, is like, I think that's very reasonable.
Yeah. And I think, in a really, like to strip it down even more basic, for some of the listeners, there's, we could have, say, again, like an injury, like coming back to that concept of an injury, why this injury might not repair and that one does, like what's different, and I've worked with some people and it can come up that that injury just happened to occur at a time that you might have been going through a bunch of other stress, like a relationship breakup. And the body, again, being a dynamic system, we like to think we can compartmentalize, but we're pretty not very good at that. So that injury and that kind of emotional stress just kind of map together in just the stress system in the brain. And so we can then end up with these kind of interwoven, interesting patterns that happen with us. Like, why do I only kind of get an itchy nose around this situation but not this one? And why does this injury only come up here but not there? Or why am I great at speaking about this topic and to these people, but you ask me on a one-on-one, I can't do it. And so that's the bit I love about kinesiology. People come to me with those kind of questions. They're like, well, I'm kind of cool with this, but and that's the bit where we kind of use that muscle testing to go basically searching through the systems to go, it's like, it's a really simplistic way of looking, but like, is it here? Is it here? Is the stress here? Is it here? Is it here? Like, where is that predominant stress? And then we get a response, and then kind of practitioner and client together start to work out that. So it's this time and linked with this, and these are the kind of the things that are seeming to be like showing up in your system, and that's how we start to get the talking to the body and navigating through.
Yeah.
stresses.
So my understanding that is that a client has a particular issue, whether it's physiological, psychological, emotional, whatever's happening. It sounds like it can be any of those, all of those combined across a broad spectrum. And then in that discovery process you talk about with the client, is you're asking the body questions and it's giving you biofeedback via a muscular inhibition response, like it's switching off. And then you're able to read that and discover where to go from that.
Yep. And
then from that's a healing process to get to the underlying cause, or?
Yeah. So I'm going to ask you a question actually, because this is one that gets posed and discussed in fields a lot, and I'm assuming it's discussed in your field as well. Do we need the conscious understanding of the issue in order to heal?
Good question. So, I mean, my training and my concept of psychology is that I've been wonderfully taught from my supervisor, Alan, who very much goes, hey, whatever you think about Freud, he had some interesting concepts, but he really gave us this understanding of the id, the superego, and the ego. And what that enabled us to understand is that there's stuff that we're conscious of, there's stuff that is subconscious or that sits in the unconscious. That is just this stuff that's happening that is trying to do different things. So the idea then is that you've got this version of yourself that wants to do something, and then you've got another version of yourself that wants to do something else. And so therefore, my underlying, you talk about underlying assumptions or philosophies, is that consciousness is polarity. We have this polarizing underlying consciousness that we all have, and that is very adaptive to our environment, right? What happens, in my understanding of when stuff becomes maladaptive, why someone come and see me as a client, is that there is one version of that, whether it's the superego or the id, that is out of balance, that is making them want to do something. And I give a simple example is you've got the perfectionistic or over-perfectionistic, maladaptive perfectionistic athlete who just wants to be amazing, has an amazing dream to be amazingly perfect. But at what cost? And there's the other part of them that just gets absolutely decimated and they get completely overwhelmed, right? So to answer your question, my job then is clearly the ego, which is this middle bit, isn't mediating those two desires. And my job's then to understand and to illuminate the active ingredient that is out of balance. And then the individual, by that illumination, then is able to then do the self-healing. I can't tell someone, hey, don't be hard on yourself, buddy. Not going to work. Or if you've got a depressed client, it's like, mate, just don't be sad. That doesn't work. So to specifically answer your question, my understanding is that the healing comes from the integration of those parts of the psyche.
Nice.
Yeah. We went a little bit rabbit hole there.
No. So
I've never really properly put all that out.
I like the way you just put that there.
Yeah.
And because I actually don't know where I sit with that, because again, the feedback around why some people like kinesiology, and I've got to say it's a great modality to work with teenagers.
Yeah. Because
they don't need to do a lot of talking through it. Like some sessions they're really talk heavy, others they're really not. And because of that biofeedback, and sometimes it's just a matter, hey, this seems to be going on. Do you reckon that makes a bit of sense to you? And that's like great. I've now got buy-in and conscious recognition. That'll do. But we know kinesiology works with babies.
Wild. It's
done on animals. Wild, and same as like kind of homeopathy based on the same kind of principles. Who clearly, well, maybe there is definitely a consciousness there with animals, and there is definitely consciousness there with babies, but you don't go through that same illumination process. But similarly, they're also not so adapted and hooked into the story and their issue. So change can be a little bit different in those.
Yeah, well, and also
versions.
The other assumption that with psychology is that if that is a neurotic problem, meaning they're in a state of neurosis, so it's different to a psychosis and a underlying genetic a problem, is that something happened in their life, something changed in their concept of themselves or the concept of the world that made it maladaptive. So therefore, they're needing insight to then be able to integrate that. So yeah, that would be hard to do with a child.
Yeah.
But that's why you use different modalities with younger people.
And that's predominantly the way I work. Like that exact thinking. It's I use the kinesiology because I like to work a lot with people with like trauma, or again like kind of the clients that have tried a lot of other things. So I try to use the kinesiology to get down to often the kind of the time when that maladaptive reasoning, decision, choice point was made, so that we can consciously start to unravel that. But it's also not necessary. And that's where the life force and the other way of working with kind of kinesiology comes in. I've certainly had my own sessions where kind of things were brought up and I didn't kind of have that moment. I didn't click in. But then 2 weeks later, suddenly like from deep within the recesses of me, something it's kind of smack into my brain and this major insight would happen. I'm like, oh, that's what that was all about. And that's just the process of the body doing its own self-healing and the process that it chooses to go through with that. And that's where I was saying I like that very client-centered way of working with the body, because it's based on this body. It is this assumption that the body has wisdom. It layered stress in a particular way from like adaptation, coping, and it will want to take those stresses off in a particular way as well. And that's where I like it as a modality, because we tend to have a lot less healing crises or come up against major stresses, because you are kind of working with this concept of permission with the body.
Right. And so the question then is, like, how on earth did you find yourself in this field? Like, how does one find themselves in kinesiology?
I think it finds you,
right,
as it does as a client. Yeah, both practitioner and client. Like it's just this thing that it finds you. I was working in the health system and wasn't loving it. Got a bit disillusioned. Loved the work I was doing in the field, but didn't love the system. And so I was looking to study. I don't know if I was going to do kind of PhD, like to kind of get in there. And then, but I had had a lot of health issues myself, and just the path that I'd found through mainstream had been unsuccessful for me, and I was getting sicker in my 20s, and there weren't great answers for it. And you know, I've got a family member who's quite high up in the medical field, and they'd also kind of got involved because of having a lot of migraines. I was really quite unwell through my late teens and 20s, and I'd had chronic fatigue myself, and I was a high achieving perfectionist, the classic. And the feedback from the family was like, I just think you're one of the few % of the population that this medicine doesn't work with. You can't help. You're just going to have to learn to live with it. And there was something in my system that went, nah. And so I sought out alternative therapies, and it worked brilliantly for me.
Wow. And
so coming from a very medical kind of dominant model to this, it was uncomfortable, but it worked well. And so when I was kind of looking to change across, I was like, oh, this works and this works and this works. Like homeopathy works and chiropractic works, and like, you know, I love it all. But and then I came across kinesiology, and kinesiology is a bit of a bowerbird that kind of, because of that muscle testing, it pulls like from a lot of the complementary medicine sphere. So you can learn a lot of rebalancing or like little techniques within the kinesiology field. So I went to study it for my own personal interest, and 2 days later I was in the course, and that was it for me. And it was like remembering. There's like talk about this body wisdom part. For me, it was like remembering, and it was just this. It was like the most natural way to live, to kind of be more in tune with your system. And so that's how I think kinesiology found me. I then went down the rabbit hole of teaching it and all that kind of stuff, which has been a great joy. So, yeah.
Yeah, and it's really interesting coming from that more clinical, medical, because were you in the hospital system?
Yeah, so first training as an occupational therapist,
Yep.
and I went through the mental health
Yep.
system. So, yeah, I used to work in acute mental health and community settings.
Yeah, and so you had all that traditional medical training, and you used the word that it was difficult to when you were transitioning to studying of kinesiology. What was difficult about that?
Difficult thing was going from a very accepted field to a very challenged field that comes with a lot of skepticism.
Oh, personally?
Yeah.
Right, yeah, that's interesting.
And it came at me from my circle, you know, that, you know, and again, like I'll be quite honest, a lot of people that, like there'll be people, if anyone's seen a kinesiologist, there'll be some people that like, people like, it's awesome, you know, and other people who are like, charlatan.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're getting ripped off like that. That's kind of hard as like to make that transition as a practitioner.
Yeah. How did you process that? Because how does that feel being so well respected, OT, mental health practitioner in the hospital system, the gold standard of practice, to then being even potentially called a charlatan?
Yeah, potentially by like people who love you.
Yeah, wow. What was that
so
like?
it was tough, but I didn't have a choice. Yeah, I felt so much more at home being able to listen to the feedback of my body, being able to listen to the wisdom. And what I particularly loved was also helping people listen to their own wisdom. And that made it completely worth it.
So you had this greater feeling of purpose or why, that you knew that no matter what the other people think, that this is my direction and purpose and what I need to do?
I don't know if it was that conscious. As I said, it just more felt like coming home.
Right.
It just felt more ease-filled. Yeah, like I felt in my previous way of managing my own body and health and the chronic fatigue and the energy stuff I'd had, I felt like everything was hard work. Like, you know, if I was to manage the kind of managing it down the recommendations I'd had it all took a lot of effort, and it was using force, and it felt like going against. And so there was this constant sense of pushing, exhaustion, and then kind of failing at it. And I felt a similar kind of thing to a degree. I loved the field. I said I loved the field, but I felt a similar kind of thing. It's like pushing against a system that wasn't enabling flow. And so when I came across this kind of concept and thinking of like your body knows, and how do all we need to do is just like keep finding like and understanding what these signals it's giving you is trying to say. You know, and low energy is a great signal in the body that isn't just straight, you've got low energy. Yeah, it was that this is not giving me life. And certain things weren't giving me life. And so kind of tapping into that, it was just a no-brainer for me. But yeah, there's a lot of skepticism in this field, and it's good. The skepticism's great.
Yeah, it's the scientific model.
It's the scientific model, and we should be skeptical. At the same time, curious. As long as skepticism doesn't, I believe, override that inner wisdom, which is calling you to something.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a spectrum like anything else, in the sense that you can't just, totally trust the science. Like, we've heard that, a couple of years ago, that saying, you're like, that is just not how the scientific model works. Totally. It's like even when Einstein released his stuff and whatever, it's like, oh no, we're going to question gravitational waves, but it's Einstein, but that's the scientific process. But at the same, so healthy skepticism, I think, is super important. It's literally the scientific model. But the other way of going, so we can't just completely trust the thing, but then also you can't completely shut off and not be curious about alternative ways, because then we don't grow and develop. But I do also really appreciate that there's a real person behind people's views and skepticism. Like, it's so easy to go like, you use the word charlatan and be like, oh no, that just write something off. But it's like, but this is some person, like you're a person behind it, that you've changed your career, you've had family members question and whatever. And that's the bit that I don't ever understand, when people are like overly skeptical of it, because there's a real person behind it and they're doing it for some reason.
Yeah. Yeah. And respecting that informed awareness, you know, and Yeah, totally. But I'm going to bring it back just out of kinesiology. It's the same thing. Yeah, like skepticism, even with kinesiology in it, is really helpful. To not like, there's this concept of muscle testing, but it's also not law. Like we don't want it. Like it's there's an ethical component embedded within kinesiology to not use that muscle testing to override a person's own choice and well-being. So, like, again, coming back to the chocolate thing, yeah, he's like, no, like there's a choice not to treat, obviously, based on that. But you also couldn't use it to kind of go like to say to someone, it's like, your body's telling me that you need to be having 10 sessions with me every week, right? Like that's where I'm going to want some healthy skepticism.
Yes.
That kind of stuff. But also similarly, if you have kinesiology, to understand that it is an in-the-moment thing. So sometimes, like I don't work a lot with nutrition, but I know a lot of other kinesiologists do. There might be this sense of, oh, your body needs this. And when we feel that, like there's a real buy-in when you feel your muscle respond from unlocking to locking, or that kind of stuff. You're like, whoa, my body really wants this. But that is in that moment, and it might be for a period of time. And so, just say it's like a vitamin. There's a healthy way to take a vitamin. You don't kind of go, oh, my body really wants this, so I'm going to take 15,000 of them for the rest of my life, because there's this concept from Ayurveda, which I love, which I think is worth talking about. It's just kind of coming up as I think of it, which is right time, right place. Like anything can be a medicine and anything can be a toxin, given the right time and the right place. And that's where I love kinesiology, because it's like, well, this is really healthy for me, right? It's like, well, your body's kind of not showing that that's the case, or there's a stressor around this. It's like, but it's healthy. But there's that right time, right place, and where does that balance change? And so, there can be that misunderstanding with kinesiology of, my kinesiologist told me I needed this, but without kind of knowing that could be limited, time limited, for how long,
right? That
kind of stuff. Does that
make
context
sense?
There's context around it, and I'm not sure how I ended up there.
Well, no, it's just that I think we like to play in absolutes.
Yeah.
And you see that playing out in bloody society and politics and everything. It's easier for our brain to go black or white, good or bad, play in absolutes. It's easier. But I think nuance and context plays such a big role. And to your point there, I'm going, yes, psychological tools are great in context.
Yeah.
Like, or a hammer, as I said before, it's like if you don't know how to use the hammer,
absolutely,
when to use the hammer, why you'd even use the hammer, then potentially you could do damage.
Yeah.
But a hammer is a very, very useful tool in a lot of different settings.
Yeah, and that's the kinesiology. It is a tool, and it's used in many different practitioners' hands. So, a lot of your listeners might have already come across it without knowing they've come across kinesiology, because it's really widely used in chiropractic.
Right.
So there are chiropractors who work as kinesiologists. It kind of came from chiropractic, but there's also just the muscle testing component the chiropractor will use to make sure they're treating the right part of the body.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. So there's a range of different uses, not just of the skill of the muscle testing, but the modality of kinesiology. Do you and have you then been more specified in a certain direction?
Yeah, so I trained in something called holistic kinesiology, which is the real bowerbird of kinesiology. There's lots of different ways to train in kinesiology. You can do, this is where the problems start. You can do a weekend course and almost just call yourself a kinesiologist. But the standard in Australia, the base standard is a diploma.
Right.
Though you can work with a certificate 4 level, I think. There's also advanced diploma in kinesiology. But there's also a lot of where kinesiology came from was quite lay. It came out of chiropractic, and it was a chiropractor predominantly who had a lot of these tools that went, the rest of the population should know this. This is something that parents should have to be able to treat their children. This is something teachers should have to be able to use in the classroom. And so he developed Touch for Health.
I've heard of that.
Yeah.
Touch for Health.
So Touch for Health is kind of where kinesiology really was born. So it went from being in chiropractors' hands to treating, to teaching lay people, which then became a thing of its own, which then spiraled off and became its own profession again. So that's kind of how it came about. And Touch for Health grew and grew and grew, and then it became so complex that people were using it as a modality to treat. And then predominantly in Australia and a couple of other places, they then standardised that a little bit better and put more training involved to make it safer to work on as a practitioner. So having anatomical training, nutritional training, counselling training, all of that kind of stuff, ethics that go to make up a field and a profession. So yeah, I'm trained in holistic kinesiology, but there's a range of other fields, and holistic kinesiology kind of has taken the best kind of replicable evidence-based treatments and pushed them together to train.
Okay. And then you specialise in, like, so what would be like your more typical
My typical thing,
presentations?
I came from the mental health. I'm comfortable sitting in that field. I love predominantly working with people who've had trauma, but really who shows up to me are the people often that everything else has failed, or they're getting pretty desperate, or they're wanting to really refine something. So they're looking to use the kinesiology to get quite specific with some things. So that's more on that potentially performer side of things. So I get the complex unwell, that nothing else is working. Or
Kind of like where you were in
kinda
your
like where I
journey,
was.
going, I'm getting a bit of a brick wall from the traditional medical field, but I feel like surely I can do something about it.
Yeah. And I get that. I get the people with trauma who want a nice kind of gentle in with it sometimes. And again, I get the performer side of things. So people looking to refine and use that use it to thrive a little bit more.
I love that. So, and very similar to, I guess, my own practices and what I do in there. So it's super, super interesting. I'm curious, from your knowledge, all of your knowledge, not just kinesiology, but everything you've done there, and now what you know, do you feel like there are any big misunderstandings, myths that you see that's perpetuated in your client presentations or in society today, that with your deeper knowledge of stuff you're going, well, it's probably still causing problems and people don't quite understand from your understanding?
That's a good question. So general kind of
from the
myths.
Yeah, and I guess more of like, the presentations of the clients that you're seeing and stuff like.
Yeah, I'd say one of the big ones is there's a couple that come to mind. The work harder myth. Like, if I'm not succeeding, then I'm doing something wrong, or I need to work harder. So that myth, which I think comes, like, I was a child of kind of through the 80s and 90s. So, that kind of success and we can have it all kind of thing. So I think that myth of, if I am not succeeding, then I just need to work harder. And I think that's creating a lot of internal turmoil, sense of failure, shame, and a whole lot of burnout. Across a bunch of fields, whether it be someone in their day-to-day job, a CEO, or a performer on some level. Because I think, from working with, again, it's probably predominantly kinesiology, but my own personal experience, trying to bring out that wisdom of the body in terms of, why is this a struggle? And that's the one of the biggest challenges. This is a struggle because it's supposed to be a barrier so that I correct course and kind of move in a different direction, or is it a struggle because I need to engage a different energy or a different approach to something instead of just constantly pushing through. So I think kind of the biggest myth of like forcing is probably the most damaging one that I see.
Yeah, because it's really interesting because I guess we kind of have this concept, and it'd be interesting why you think that is so common. But I feel like we just got this concept that, well, in most other things, you just got to work harder and you'll get the outcome. So it's not really, the problem is that you're just not putting enough in, and surely if you just put enough in, you'll get what you want out.
Yeah.
But there's a big but there.
There's a big but. You know, there's this, I don't use it, but a lot of people spell kinesiology, easy-ology.
Okay.
About like bringing the ease back into it. So finding that like your more ease-filled path through it. And, you know, I've, because of that, I've followed a lot of the kind of like this, I love the concept of flow-based stuff as a feedback tool. And because I think that's when we're in more of that pranic life fulfilling, regardless of whether in that you know, sports person flow state or just that flow state in life. So, you know, I think from me, like one of the things that, so this is probably the other myth maybe is I was reflecting on like kind of kinesiology and my journey before having a chat with you. And if I was just like really sum it up, I'd say my journey has been a journey of unlearning.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and I'm kind of looking now, and like I've been doing this for 20 years.
You want to put the exact number?
And we'll put it this way: if I was in the States, I'd be able to drink.
Yeah.
I've had that, like kinesiology, a lot of the time when I'm working, but also when I've had it, it's like a process of peeling back layers. It's taking off rather than putting in. Like that if I'm doing, that's where I kind of come back to that hard work. If I'm failing at something, then maybe I just need to do more instead of, maybe it's actually about unlearning something, doing less, getting out of your own way. And that process of getting out of your own way, I think, is one of the hardest things that we do in life. And so it's this kind of like stripping back and back and back and back. And so kind of that unlearning process.
I love that concept. And is it coming from that assumption that the body has the wisdom and the answer, that a lot of the time is that we're cognitively kind of getting in the way a bit?
Totally. So it's coming from that assumption plus that psychological model of, which I'm not going to frame very well, but that psychological model of kind of wounding and the assumptions we then make, or the learning that we've been instilled in us inadvertently, or sometimes like really consciously by parents and society. You know, so for example, you can't sing, which never gives a choice to find the voice and to enjoy singing, right? Instead of unlearning that to go, like, it's like, actually, that was just someone else's opinion. But that gets deep in the system, that gets deep in the neurology, it gets deep in the memories. So until we can like peel that layer off, you're not freed to unlearn that and therefore to be in that body wisdom, to let it find its own free path through. So kind of I'd say it's both, kind of coming from that body wisdom perspective, but also the journey of what it took to get to that body wisdom, which was not listening to everything that was in the head and that I'd learned, and kind of stripping that back out to free, to kind of be actually able to listen to that biofeedback mechanism in my body, almost separate to the testing tool. So once you've had a lot of kinesiology, you start to listen to your body a bit differently.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and it's a journey that my understanding is that the client and the practitioner kind of do together there, and then there's that greater awareness and stripping back and allowing that innate wisdom to come through. And I'm curious because like my understanding is that, because I've been wanting to chat to you for a long time and you're super busy, so clearly you're doing some fantastic work, and I know that you're, you know, there's so many people, like your books are closed. Like, what do you think it is either about kinesiology that you feel has made you so sought after, but also you and what you bring to it? I'm just curious because so many people absolutely rave about you.
Yeah. Thanks. I think I don't know if you can. I don't know how to separate them off, like of those two. The process of me unlearning and listening to my body wisdom, I feel like it stepped me into a much more judgment-free place, so that when someone brings something to me, like so much of that underlying kind of stuff that gets in our own way might be shame-based or kind of unknown and quite uncomfortable to even internally reveal, let alone speak it to someone, that I'm like, I feel like I'm in that fairly judgment-free place these days. I think I could have said that in my youth, but in these days. So I like to think that's kind of part of it. Plus there's that, we hear a lot of it at the moment, that co-regulation aspect in therapy as part of the recovery process. That again, when there's not a lot that I haven't heard over my many years, again, from that kind of judgment free. So my cells and everything, my own internal system is usually quite quiet and still, which provides a really nice space to be able to feel like just internally very safe. So I suspect I hope that's one of the reasons. That's the assumption I have made about it. People could just like the sound of my voice for all I know.
We get to listen to you now.
Yeah, but also kinesiology as a modality is just pretty cool, really, because when it's used really well, you get to learn a lot about yourself, and that you get to learn a lot about yourself in a pretty quick process, because it's a tool to use to cut through a lot of the stuff. So, we're pretty time precious people these days. So I think that's one of the reasons, like some people would prefer to go and see a kinesiologist and kind of cut through some stuff really quickly.
So it's that desire to get answers quickly, because I would feel that there's an assumption that have been a greater move towards kinesiology or these alternative disciplines, especially in the last handful of years.
Totally.
And if we speak broadly about that, like, what do you feel is, I don't know if the word missing is correct, but like, what's missing from the traditional medical field, or why do you feel more people are moving to these alternatives more and more than ever before? And it's not to say that anything's lacking or anything like that, but there's clearly a fair bit of an interest and almost an exodus from the traditional models to alternative. Yeah,
and definitely, I mean, there's a lot of kinesiologists that are really busy.
Yeah.
So, there's thousands of people a week experiencing kinesiology. And that's just in Australia, let alone all over the world. I'd say it's to do with that whole body dynamic systems. That's definitely the feedback I get a lot is like people might come to me, okay, I've got this problem with my thyroid, but why? Not just treat it, but why? And what else can I do other than potentially just take medication? Can I look at it from an emotional perspective? Can I look at it from a lifestyle perspective? Can I do more to kind of address the underlying rather than that that looking just purely at that one individual thing in the body as a separate thing, and being able to look at it as part of the whole system.
Yes, it's the holistic approach, the whole system, because I feel, even within psychology for sure, but through the medical model, it gets very symptom focused.
Yeah.
That you see a specialist and they treat the symptom.
Yeah.
But as we've discovered throughout the discussion today, and we know very well, is that there's a whole human there
Yeah.
There's a whole biopsychosocial model that goes behind that human. And to only look at the symptom that's in front of them is not only not respecting the entire human, but it is not also representing the context that we spoke about earlier. So I think that in my understanding, and in very much my approach now as a clinician too, is I go, I treat the human, I treat the person. And that's why I kind of really shy away from people like, what are tools for anxiety? I'm like, well, then there's that hammer analogy we had before, but it's going, well, it's different for everyone. And let's treat the human because, as you said, there's so many different things that go into that. And do you feel it's also more proactive and solution focused? I feel the medical field is very reactive in the sense that you come to me when you've got a problem.
Yeah.
And then we're going to go treat it, and then you have some pills and you do surgery and cut things away, and then you go. Whereas that proactive approach is coming from more of awareness and understanding.
Yeah, and I think that's doctors are busy, right? They don't have time for that proactive approach, which is where I think a lot of people will seek out alternatives. People aren't wanting to get sick, and we are getting sicker. Right, we're getting sicker. We're not becoming a healthier population. We're getting sicker and sicker as we're more disconnected from that whole person and from the things in life that generally create health and well-being. And I think people are wanting to try to prevent a lot of things going wrong. So I think that's one reason. But it's just that whole system. And a lot of people want to be seen as a person. Yeah, we're the same with kinesiology. When someone comes to me and goes, do you treat this? I'm a bit cheeky, but I'm kind of like, well, no, I treat the person. We don't actually treat, we will take into consideration what's going on, but we're looking at that whole system as a whole, and to realize that symptom is a communication, or it's the bit that's spat out from the body not working well. And we just need to work out on what other level do we need to get that whole system working well so that you're completely well. I can't remember the name, but back from many years ago, she was a huge in the alternative kind of cancer wellness side of things, and she said, when we heal, we don't just heal one thing. You don't just heal your cancer, you heal. When that whole system comes back into balance, you come back into balance. So life looks very different.
Yeah, that's beautiful for sure. And maybe that's actually at the core of the interest, is that people just want to heal more holistically, and they want to feel that life force that goes with being healed.
Yeah.
And maybe they're not getting that in other ways.
Yeah, people know when they don't feel right. You know when you don't feel right. And it's hard when you don't feel right and you go to a doctor or you go to someone and you go, I don't feel right. And they're like, well, the blood tests say you're okay. And you're like, but I still don't feel right. So, people know. Yeah, and I think I love to listen to people. Yeah, I love to listen to people because I used to walk into, never forget me when I was cheeky little 16-year-old, I walked into my GP and said, there's something wrong with my liver. The GP was like, well, I'm your GP and I'll tell you what's wrong with you. Literally, I think he said that. And I later discovered that I had a diagnosis of hypochondriasis from saying that. And then many years later, because I was having chiropractic to deal with my migraines, and I had this fill-in chiropractor at my chiropractor who was a real kinesiology chiropractor. She used muscle testing. This was right at the beginning of my journey, and she said, "You've got a problem with your liver." I was like, "Hallelujah!" And she said, "Nothing else is going to really work until that liver works." And she did her stuff and completely changed my life. But somewhere in my body, I knew all along there was something. And what was wrong with my liver, was I'd had a bad accident, and I'd a horse riding accident, and I'd fallen, and my viscera had twisted. My liver was literally twisted in my system, and so it functionally couldn't work properly. So when that was able to be treated, it's like the body just could then kind of pick all the stuff up and heal itself.
Wow. And the body was giving the information to the kinesiologist, and they were picking up on that. Yeah, it's just a very amazing thing. But I do like the idea that the person, well, the way I would frame it up is, and I think it's just by the nature of the setup. When you see a doctor, a GP, as we said, they're super, super busy. Maybe you get 15, 20 minutes with them and they do a fantastic job for what's set up. But it's set up that they're the expert and you go into them and be like, hey, what's happening here? And what I would say to my clients is, no, you're the expert on you. That's different. It's not like the GP, is that you're the expert on you. I'm just helping guide you to understanding you better.
Yep.
And reading these different things and feeding it back to you, and then you go, oh yeah, that's it, sort of thing. But I love that idea that fundamentally they're the expert on them.
You'd make a perfect kinesiologist.
I have thought about
that's the thinking. Yeah, that's the exact same thinking. And then it's just a modality and a tool to help you understand yourself better and to be more like in integrity with that. And that's where we haven't had a chance to talk about it, but that muscle to kind of response, you can use it also to get people to feel like, it's like, this is how it feels when you're, this is how your muscles feel. You can kind of use it a bit stronger. This is how your muscles feel when you're kind of, in this situation. And I was like, yeah, that feels good. This is how your muscles feel when you're in this situation. And it's like everything goes weak and collapse. And you can't deny that. You're like, you feel that.
Yeah, it's funny because I've tried to resist it before.
You can't.
And it's like,
it's not a
so
strength
weird.
thing. It's not a strength thing. It's a biofeedback.
Yeah,
it's
it literally turns it off. And you're like, no, I'm just going to,
I'm going to muscle through it.
Yeah.
And that's that whole point of helping it, like, us to understand. It's like, and that's when you go, it's like, well, yeah, that's what you normally do, right? You normally muscle through. You're like, blah, blah, blah. And this is what it's doing to your body, instead of like, and you kind of get that, and you're like, oh, this is really what it's doing to my body. We can't deny that anymore. So it's that really quick biofeedback learning to go, oh, this is me, and that I think brings in that deeper responsibility of, it's actually up to me to look after myself.
Yeah, I love it. It's so empowering for the individual. And I think that's also maybe gets a little bit missed in like the real Western traditional medical model, is that the knowledge is externalized to the providers.
Yeah.
And I feel there is a huge need to provide the wisdom and knowledge that to the individual to make them really feel empowered that they can take ownership over their healing process.
Yeah, beautiful, which is potentially why we have such a strong pull towards the complementary medicines.
Absolutely.
At the moment, because they mostly all have that fundamental philosophy underneath.
And if someone was now maybe considering discovering, investigating kinesiology, what would you say to them, or what would you encourage them to be kind of curious about?
Well, I would say right time, right place.
Yeah.
Right? Like if you're really feeling it because there's something that we've spoken about here that has really resonated or woken something up in you, then I'd say absolutely go ahead. Having a kinesiologist, like going to a kinesiologist because someone else has told you to do it, can be really successful and you can really wake you up. But, the process of like right time, right place, we're ready to change in the way we're ready to change. So we, as a kinesiologist, we can help you kind of see where you're at in that change process. But I'd say right time, right place, but go for it. It's fun. There's often tears, but it's fun. Like it's such an empowering way to explore your own well-being, your own subconscious, your own barriers, and a great way to get out of your own way.
Love it. That's the slogan right there. Anything else that we didn't touch on that you wanted to share, Nat? Because I'm conscious of your time.
Yeah, no, I think we got it.
I think we got it. I think we got it. I think I understand kinesiology a
little
bit better now.
Looping it around and around.
Yeah,
different
it's
ways.
like I tried not to go too into deep of the mechanism to actually conceptualize it better. But I think it's just, well, maybe I can feed this back to you. It's just that the body wants to move back towards healing and homeostasis, and it will provide a biofeedback in the form of a muscle
Perfect.
turning on and off, and then you as the trained practitioner can understand that and interpret that and then allow the body to heal itself more.
That's a perfect way
Did
of
I get
describing it. I think you should put that in.
Okay, I'll put that in the description. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Nat. I absolutely love what you're doing. I know there's so many people sing your praises, and you're absolutely amazing. You've changed so many people's lives, so I really appreciate you and everything you do and your ability to advocate for this wonderful profession that I think people should check out.
Thank you very much for that, lovely. Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to get to talk about this and share it to people who might not know it.
Yes,
So
I think it's an
love what you're
important
doing,
message. Thanks, Nat.
Thanks.